Okay, well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tamara Herman, and I am a Program Manager of Capital Strategies here at Share, and you are at the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network's annual Proxy Power Webinar. I'm speaking to you today from Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. The Canadian Capital Stewardship Network, or the CCSN, is a network of Canadian pension fund trustees and trade union representatives hosted at Share. We launched the CCSN 2 years ago to share information and foster opportunities for joint action where the labor movement and responsible investment intersect. For those of you who are new to this work, this time of year is proxy season. It's the time when most publicly listed companies in Canada and the US hold their annual general meetings. The purpose of this webinar is to highlight key votes related to decent work at companies that will be voted on at AGMs, and these companies will be either headquartered in Canada or they have a significant employment footprint in Canada. Over the past 2 years, we've heard countless companies thank their frontline workers for going above and beyond the call of duty during the pandemic. We've also seen large asset managers and investors commit to engaging companies on the S in ESG, with a specific focus on workers in their analysis of how companies perform on social issues. The mainstream narrative might be shifting, with less companies describing workers as a cost in their reporting and more describing workers as assets. There are also signs that investors are recognizing that inequality, like climate, is a systemic risk with portfolio-wide implications that they cannot diversify their way out of or hedge against. But there are questions around how to ensure that these narrative shifts result in concrete changes for workers. We've all seen hero wage chop-ups come and go. We've heard about how workers in companies' direct operations and supply chains have been subjected to unsafe or unfair working conditions as multiple waves of the pandemic hit. We've seen companies fight fiercely against workers' attempts to exercise their rights to join a union, to express their voice collectively in order to influence their wages and their working conditions. And now, as inflation hits the highest point in decades, the gaps between company commitments to workers and the actions that they're taking to protect workers are even more glaring. And so it's in this context that we are inviting shareholders to send a strong message to the companies that they invest in, that we need to see concrete and measurable changes in how they approach labor issues. One of the most accessible ways to do this is through proxy voting at a company AGM. And so I would ask just to switch the slide so that you can take a look at the agenda. There we go. And so we're going to be talking about various companies today. We're going to be looking at Loblaws and talking about their domestic supply chain and their global supply chain. We're going to talk about Restaurant Brands International, which of course owns Tim Hortons, and how they're dealing with labor in the midst of what some economists are calling the Great Resignation. And then we're going to be taking a quick look at some other key resolutions, including one at Amazon, Walmart, SNC-Lavalin, as well as a new and late edition, which is a vote recommendation at Wendy's. And so before we get to all of that, I'd like to invite Jacob Leibovich, who's the CCSN Program Officer, to say a few words about proxy voting.
Thanks, Tamara. And hello, everyone, and welcome. I speak to you today from the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. So we'll start today just talking a little bit about what proxy voting is. Essentially, anyone who owns common voting shares has the right to vote for or against management proposals or shareholder proposals at the annual general meetings that are taking place this upcoming season. Voting rights are valuable assets for pension funds and other asset owners. Trustees have an obligation to ensure that shares owned by the plan are voted in a way that supports the interests of the plan's participants over the long term. The trustees of the fund and anyone appointed to vote proxies on the trustees' behalf have a duty of loyalty to exercise their proxy voting authority with the prudence, skill, and diligence that a prudent person would exercise in managing the property of others. Failing to vote the plan's share, voting without consideration of the effects of the vote, or voting arbitrarily with or against management violates these duties. Voting influences corporate behavior. By exercising their voting rights, shareholders communicate with corporate boards and management about matters that affect the company's governance, its performance, and its effective management of issues including human and labor rights. Now, not long ago, shareholder activism was seen as being on the margins. Today, shareholder season is followed closely in the business press as resolutions of particular companies get scrutinized like an upcoming sporting event. Investors from the Canadian labor movement have an opportunity to use their votes and their voices to support labor rights, decent work, and racial justice. And today we'll get into the why and the how. Speaking of labor, no one understands the inherent power of organizing as well as the trade union. As Tamara mentioned, in 2020, labor appointed trustees on pension fund boards and trade union representatives from across Canada came together and founded the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network, the CCSN. This network committed to making meaningful changes in capital markets through the effective stewardship of workers' capital. The CCSN draws strategic guidance from an advisory board of union representatives. Now, across the world, trade unions and worker-nominated fund trustees are working together to mobilize workers' capital to uphold workers' rights and contribute to a just, sustainable economy. The CCSN is part of this effort, and we hope that you will join us when we take action. For the trustees on this call, we invite you to urge the staff or service providers who vote your proxies to support these resolutions and vote recommendations. For those of you who vote proxies, we hope that you will consider these items when you cast your ballots. If you want more information, we invite you to reach out and we will put you in touch with our engagement team. And finally, I wanted to put a plug in for our upcoming CCSN proxy investor brief that will be released next week. This is an easy guide to all the resolutions we are raising today. So let me now hand it back to Tamara. Thanks.
Thanks, Jacob. And Stephanie, I think you can take the slides down now as we move into the next section. So this is an interactive event. We're going to be inviting you all to ask questions and engage with the panelists after every segment and every presentation. And we're going to start today with somewhere we're all familiar with, the grocery store, and Loblaw specifically. So chances are that you've gotten groceries there or at one of its many subsidiaries, which includes Superstore, T&T, No Frills, and Provigo. So we're going to look at two resolutions that ask this company to take a step in improving conditions for workers in the supply chains, the first in Canada and the second in global supply chains. In Canada, conditions in the domestic agri-food sector are a racial justice issue. The Canada food system depends on migrant workers. It's estimated that 1 in 5 farm workers is a migrant worker. And so today we have the pleasure of welcoming Syed Hussan, Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. And he'll be talking to us about the labor conditions that migrant workers experience in Loblaw's domestic supply chain. So hi, Hussan. I think you're somewhere in there.
I'm here. Hi.
Hi.
I hope you have that video ready.
We do.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So
yeah.
I'm just going to start to introduce myself. My name is Hussan. I'm the Executive Director of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. We are a membership-based body, which is to say that all the strategic decisions, as well as all of the implementations of our campaigns, are made by members who are migrants in farm work, domestic work, current and former international students, and undocumented people. We're going to play a short video from Christopher, who's been coming to Canada for 20 years. He works at a berries farm, working particularly with strawberries, which is one of the largest providers of strawberries to Loblaws in the country. He's currently working, so he's not able to be here. And he's asked us to not share his face. So we're sharing a photo of him, and he's one of the workers in that photo. So we'll hear from him, and then I'll just speak for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you.
That for more than 50 years, migrant workers have been here. It has never been a bed of roses given the circumstances we have to undergo. To name a few: separation from family, improper accommodation, fear, intimidation, and bullied by employers, unjust and unfair deportation, little or no compensation for workers who are injured or end up dead on the job. And the long dark list goes on, all in the name of migrant worker. Don't forget that we are the one that brave extreme heat and cold to put food on your table. Most time in conditions that are unbearable, conditions that most Canadians would never stand up to. We are also the ones who help to boost your economy, even in the face of this dreaded global pandemic. A time when we should be home with our family, we still take the chance of coming here to work. Why are we called essential workers? There must be some level of importance that we are doing. So if we are seen as important to maintain the life of your food chain, then we think it's time for you to take a look in the right direction. As one voice, we are asking for better healthcare, better living condition for all workers, equal rights and justice for all, a fair compensation for injured workers, proper compensation for family of workers due to fatality on the job, family unity, and full immigration status. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think if you have been following the news in this country, you probably are aware that it is not possible to really eat in Canada. If you have eaten food at some point in the near future, you have been a person who has eaten food that has been produced by a farm worker, processed by a farm worker, brought onto a truck by a farm worker, brought to a grocery store where there was a migrant worker that worked to deliver the food, whether it is the worker who's bringing the food to you from a fast food chain or the cleaners and the workers. There's a food chain and it is made up of migrants. At the same time, I want to tell you a story about something about the largest farm in the country, and its name is Scotland. 2 years ago, there was a massive outbreak in Scotland, and as a result of that outbreak, 200 workers got COVID-19. The workers were not allowed to call for medical services. They were not. Then they complained to the bosses and the supervisors. They were told to just say nothing. Despite this, when the workers were getting so sick that one of the workers called a friend in BC, who then called 911 and had an ambulance arrive there. The ambulance took some of those workers to the hospitals, and one of them died. His name is Juan. The day after his death, one of his nephews, who also worked at the same farm, and a close friend of his, asked for the day to be able to just mourn his loss. The friend, his name is Gabriel, was threatened. He was bought a plane ticket, and the following morning, he was going to be placed on a plane to be sent back to the country. He got in touch with us. We were able to intervene, move him out that day because he would become homeless once he left. We were able to get him a temporary work permit. We made a court case, and he won the largest settlement where a farm worker has won under labor law in the country. And despite that, the largest supplier of pumpkins to Loblaws and asparagus remains Scotland Farms. Since then, they have had criminal prosecutions under Ministry of Labour charges, and a decision is expected anytime in the next couple of weeks. Likely there will be some sort of a fine that's associated with it, but this farm is continuing to provide and has changed absolutely nothing in terms of how workers' rights are protected, and has never actually claimed any guilt or taken any responsibility. As long as migrants don't have permanent resident status, they are not able to protect themselves. And employers have no incentive from the federal government laws and policies to do better, because the laws allow them to basically exploit workers. Today, you have the opportunity to pressure those employers down the line in the food chain to one of the largest buyers of their products, which is the Loblaw's food chain. And beginning this process of supporting this motion is one of the steps in which Loblaws can push on employers as migrants push from the bottom onto the employers. And then this can become a coordinated work that must be led, of course, by migrants who are at the front lines, who are in these farms, who know the situations. And so I welcome you to support this initiative. And also, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hussan, for that very compelling and on-point description of what migrant workers in Loblaw's supply chains are facing here. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Hussan? I guess I would have one quick question. Has MWAC ever had discussions with Loblaws about issues, domestic supply chain issues and workers' rights conditions?
No, we have not. We have been focused on trying to support workers to determine for themselves what are the changes they would like to see on the farms, and through that, the workers to come up essentially with a set of best practices that could then be implemented, and that could form kind of the basis of the demands, right? So the issue is, we want, if Loblaw says treat workers better, well, what defines better? And that initiative must come from the bottom. So, and that is something that we are in the process of building, not just in terms of Loblaws, but in terms of grapes and wines, in terms of strawberries and other soft, tender fruit like peaches. Yeah, so that is our current approach. Our membership has gone through a human rights catastrophe over the last 2 years with COVID-19, and that has been, survival is top of mind, but we are transitioning to trying to think through these corporate strategies.
Thank you so much. And so you mentioned in your presentation that investors have an opportunity to push one of the largest purchasers of Canadian food products this proxy season. And so on that note, while you continue to work and alongside migrant workers from the ground level, I'd like to invite Anthony Shine, who is the Director of Shareholder Advocacy at Share, to talk about how investors can support Hussan and MWAC's and migrant workers' efforts generally in securing basic labor rights. So Anthony, thanks. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks, Hussan. Thanks everyone for being here today. So my name is Anthony Shine. I'm the Director of Shareholder Advocacy here at Share. So we represent a network of institutional investors with about $90 billion in assets under management, and we support those investors to become active owners. So I lead our corporate engagement program. In the last year, we engaged with about 150 Canadian, US, and global issuers to improve their policies and practices around decent work, human rights, reconciliation with Indigenous people, and climate change as well. I'm joining you this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, from my basement in Toronto. And I'm certainly humbled to be able to live and work on traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Chippewas, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. So thanks again to Hussan and also to Chris, who we heard from anonymously a few minutes ago, for really framing the realities of what life for farm workers, particularly migrant farm workers, is so often like in Canada. I think your presentations really give a good grounding for what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, and it certainly informed the engagement that Share has been undertaking and the proposal that we filed at Loblaw, which will be on the ballot on May 5th. You'll hear me say that date a few times in the next little while. So as I alluded to, I'm to talk to you today about the engagement that we've been doing with Loblaw over the last year, and particularly about its domestic supply chain human rights risks. So of course, Loblaw is one of the most prominent Canadian brands and also one of the largest grocery retailers here in Canada as well. Just by way of sort of background around the kinds of issues and the approach that Share has taken to decent work and human rights, I want to just spend a moment to talk a bit about that. So certainly, poor workplace practices and human rights conflicts can be a serious source of operational, reputational, legal, and regulatory risks that can really impact corporate long-term financial performance and value, not to mention people's lives, while conversely providing good working conditions, equal opportunities, employee safety and well-being, fair recruitment, promotion, meeting the highest standards of employee engagement and satisfaction, and job security all contribute to better productivity, innovation, and success. So the workforce is a key driver of corporate value. We've been saying that for many years, and I know that folks on this call have been saying that as well. And that's certainly been the basis of our engagement with issuers in Canada and the US on decent work over the last number of years. We've pushed companies to improve disclosure of human capital management and to adopt clear board-level oversight for decent work. So that's sort of one piece of it. And then on a kind of parallel track, investors have also been pushing companies to adopt robust human rights due diligence practices around their supply chains. And we've tended to think about that as your supply chains outside of Canada or outside of North America. For example, following the Rana Plaza disaster, which I think people here are familiar with, Share engaged with many Canadian companies, including Loblaw, to become signatories to what was then called the Bangladesh Accord on Building and Fire Safety. And in 2021, just last year, when that accord expired, we at Share engaged again with about 14 companies to join the new accord. It's now called the International Accord. Again, that included Loblaw. I think for many investors, for consumers, and I think for a lot of companies, the base assumption has tended to be that the kinds of supply chain risks that we think about under the category of the Bangladesh Accord or offshore issues aren't really relevant, and those risks don't exist in your domestic operations. We have the Employment Standards Act in each province in Canada, right? We have strong building codes and fire safety standards in every province in Canada, right? And we have a workers' compensation regime, WSIB, where I am, different names in different provinces, right? So that should sort of protect us with basic regulatory standards that are set by government. But not exactly, and we heard a bit about that from Hussan a moment ago. We also know that farm workers generally are excluded from most of the rights and entitlements of Employment Standards Acts in jurisdictions across Canada. In Ontario, I'm most familiar with, most agricultural sector workers are exempt from most of the most important elements of the ESA, along with a hodgepodge of other categories of workers, including domestic workers, home care workers, building superintendents, and taxi drivers, who also don't have the full rights under the ESA. And we also know that agricultural workers are even more vulnerable, in addition to being excluded from the ESA and that kind of regulatory floor, because of the large volume of migrant workers in the agricultural sector. There's even greater risk here, in particular because for most, if not all of those workers, immigration status is tied directly to the employer. So migrant workers in the agricultural sector are authorized generally to work and enter the country under the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, which grants temporary visas based on temporary contracts with a particular employer. So you really have a direct and dependency on that employer for your livelihood as well as for status. So the risks of retaliation and in fact deportation are really strong disincentives to be able to speak out or grieve. It's not a surprise that in the sense that when we heard from Chris on that video a few minutes ago, we protected Chris's identity and protected that identity because the risks of retaliation are very real. So that sort of sets the stage for what's been a new component of Share's engagement in 2022 and the proposal that we have at Loblaw, again, May 5th at Loblaw, which is about the rights and treatment of migrant workers working in North American companies' domestic operations and domestic supply chains. So we're talking about things that are happening here in Canada. If you're in Ontario, just down 401 in Niagara region and towards Welland and all through farm country and many different rich agricultural parts of the country as well. I'm just an Ontario-centric person. So again, Loblaw is one of the largest food retailers and purchasers in Canada, but the company has not provided clear explanations or transparent disclosure on how its policies identify, monitor, prevent, and mitigate risks and harms to migrant workers employed through its suppliers operating within Canada. So the lack of measures to identify and address those risks is really concerning, because it may indicate that Loblaw underestimates the severity of those risks and those issues within the domestic supply chain. And that may word there should not undermine the comments that we heard a few minutes ago about that particular farm that Hussan spoke to. The failure to adopt measures to protect the human rights of migrant workers exposes shareholders to significant legal, reputational, and operational risks, and it, of course, may impact long-term value and people's lives, more importantly, and that's obviously a very pressing top-of-mind issue. So the proposal that we filed, the people are the top-of-mind piece. The proposal that we filed there was done on behalf of the BC Teachers Federation Salary Indemnity Fund, and I thought I saw somebody from BCTF in the audience, but now I'm not sure. So if you are out there, thank you for your support, and maybe you can just put up your hand in the chat there to let folks know that BCTF Salary Indemnity Fund is here. The proposal asks that the Board of Directors of Loblaw publish a report at reasonable costs omitting proprietary information with the results of an independent human rights impact assessment, identifying and assessing the actual and potential human rights impacts on migrant workers from the company's business activities, its operations and supply chain. So that appears on the proxy. It's item number 1. And again, the meeting's May 5th, put it in your calendar. Up till now, Loblaw has yet to commit to conducting an independent human rights risk assessment or on any of its high-risk supply chains, domestically or in specific food sectors where there are those risks. The company's position is that its existing code of conduct addresses these risks, but the code doesn't provide shareholders with enough information about how its current practices are adequately identifying and preventing real and existing potential human rights risks, impacts, harms, and risks to migrant workers employed directly in the supply chain. So in its opposition statement to the proposal, Loblaw states that it is committed to upholding the human rights of all people with whom it interacts, including migrant workers within the supply chain, and regularly reviews its operations to ensure actions are being taken. And really the only way that shareholders can be confident that Loblaw's actions are contributing to its stated human rights goals and its commitments is through an impact assessment of the nature that we've asked for here. So certainly the company's policies and practices are informed by leading international and industry standards, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And as a result, the kind of assessment that we're asking for here is really in line with the policy. It's the kind of thing that is needed to uphold that policy. So the UNGP, UN Guiding Principles, really provide a benchmark to assess risks to migrant workers in the company's domestic supply chain. An assessment like this will help the company and protect and help shareholders as well to understand the impacts and the perspectives of impacted rights holders, such as workers. And it will also provide the company with key actionable takeaways to address its approach to these issues going forward, rather than just reacting to an external pressure or the extensive negative media that the company has faced and other food retailers have faced over the last number of years when the kinds of tragedies that Hussan described have come up. So the company doesn't feel this is necessary, but we beg to differ, and we certainly ask that that you raise this with your managers or your proxy advisors. There is a long list of instances here, but I'll just draw your attention to one in particular that's been widely covered. One additional one in particular that's been widely covered, which is at a farm called Proxy Farms, which is one of the biggest vegetable growers in Norfolk County, again in Ontario. At least 550 workers at that farm, mostly from Mexico. And their rights were really restricted during the lockdown, not by just being told to wear masks, but actually having their right to free movement restricted, lockdowns on the farm, for example. And many workers there have made complaints and spoken to media about the degree to which they were subject to racial profiling and sort of retaliation within the community, a lot of sort of fear mongering and racism within the broader community. So with that in mind, again, the AGM is scheduled for May 5th. It's item number 1 on the ballot. So please do speak with your managers, speak with your proxy advisors, and vote yes on that item. There is a proxy alert on the Share website, which you can download and send around. I think we will also email it out, and I'll put it in the chat as well. But there's all the information I talked about is covered in there. So thanks so much for your time today, and thanks for your support for this initiative.
Thanks so much, Anthony, for going over the resolution with us. We will be sending out a proxy brief for investors on Monday. that will contain all the information around this and other shareholder resolutions. Not to call names out, but last year, Randy Sloat, who's an OP trustee, and on this call, and I think I saw Bob Dollywall, who's a trustee as well, and I've LWU nominated trustee. Both of them really kind of took our proxy vote recommendations and went to their staff and managers respectively to ask them around their voting. And so we're going to turn to that in a little bit, but just for some inspiration around what to do with this information if you are a trustee sitting on this board. And thank you, Shannon, for sharing the proxy alert for Loblaw. So on a global level, Loblaw also has extremely complex supply chains that spread across jurisdictions, including some of those where fundamental labor rights are severely under threat. This year, the BC Government and Service Employees Union, or BCGEU, has filed a shareholder resolution at Loblaw to provide investors with more information on human rights risks in Loblaw's global supply chain. And Emma Pullman is here to tell us a bit more about it. Emma is the union's capital stewardship officer and has helped build a program to leverage the union's fully divested $110 million general and strike fund to push for stronger investments that protect workers and the planet. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Tamara, and thanks everyone who is here today. So I'm joining you today from the unceded and stolen lands of the Wasanich and Lekwungen peoples, also known as Victoria, BC. So just as we've just heard some really important conversation about Loblaw's domestic supply chain, as Tamara just said, I'm going to speak more about Loblaw's global supply chain really quickly. And I want to thank our earlier speakers for really grounding this in human experience, because I think so often, you know, this comes down to like abstractions, and it's really important that we kind of have these really real conversations about the human beings that are being affected by these big corporations. So the BC General Employees Union, now called, has submitted a shareholder proposal. This is proposal number 2, again, going to a vote on May 5th, and we are asking for your support. So by way of background, in 2017, Loblaw pledged to not source cotton produced. So I'm going to speak about cotton and tomatoes and forced labor. Not source cotton produced in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. In early 2021, expanded that to include the Uyghur region in China. And then in July of 2021, Loblaw signed on to the Better Cotton Initiative. Sounds great, right? However, we've got shipping data compiled by Dr. Laura Murphy, a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at Sheffield Hallam University in the United Kingdom, that shows that Loblaw's was still supporting textiles from the Uyghur region after all of these initiatives were signed on to. We're currently examining if there's been any more recent shipments. So, and another kind of piece of background that kind of alerted us to this proposal and this issue is a CBC Marketplace investigation that happened earlier this year that showed that Loblaw's, its own PC brand and other brands, was selling tomato products produced with forced labor. So what we've done with our proposal this year is something very simple. We've asked Loblaw to disclose the results of its supplier audits, just in line with its peers. And you know, we note in our proposal that Loblaw really falls short of other retailers in this regard, and we're not asking for anything major here. Loblaw simply offers the number of total audits that it's completed, which gives some information, but actually it doesn't give investors nearly enough information to really understand what's going on. Some of Loblaw's competitors that include Walmart and Tesco add details of the results of these audits. Gildan is a company that includes more results on these audits, a classification criteria of these audits. And so there's lots of examples of their own competitors doing more in line with what we'd like to see happen. So, you know, we think that this enhanced information gives investors key information that will help ensure that Loblaw's enterprise risks are being managed and mitigated. And, you know, in Loblaw's response to our proposal, we were actually frankly quite disappointed. The company did not even mention the controversies that we raised in the proposal, and did not provide any timeline under which it was going to provide the disclosure that we requested. So the company says that it has a new ESG process in the works, but can't confirm when that will be happening or when that will be launching. And so I think, it leaves investors a bit in the lurch right now. Not sure, we can't just wait for this kind of information to become available. And so I think that this vote for this proposal is truly warranted. And there was an article a couple of days ago in the Globe and Mail, and I'm just going to quote something from Richard Manley at CPP Investments. Why are you not reporting the data that is material or that your largest peers are reporting? Is it because there's no internal capacity to do it? Because you're performing badly and don't want to tell the world about it? Because you haven't prioritized it yet? There's a conversation there to be had. And I think this really summarizes our feeling. So I think I'll just leave it there. I'll say that, we ask that you support resolution number 2 on the proxy, and, please do raise this issue with your managers and proxy advisors. And I'm happy to circulate our investor brief. And I know that more information about this proposal will be in the guide that Share sends out, or the CCSN sends out. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. Does anyone have any questions about anything that Emma just reviewed or BCGU's resolution? And please use the raise hand function, and I think I'll be able to see it. Okay, well, yet again, I have a question, but it's about another company. So last year, Emma, you spoke to us about a resolution at Dollarama that asked Dollarama to report on how it assesses and mitigates human rights risks that arise out of using third-party staffing agencies in its warehouses and distribution centers. And we had a Dollarama worker come on this call, a warehouse worker, as well as an organizer from the Immigrant Workers Center. And so this year you filed again at Dollarama. So I wanted to ask you whether anything changed following last year's resolution, and as well invite you to tell us a little bit about this year's resolution at Dollarama.
Thank you so much, Tamara. So I'll speak really quickly about this. I'll just note that we filed this proposal about 3 months ago and still have not had the opportunity to engage with the company about it. I'll let you draw your own conclusions to that. But we hope to engage with the company prior to them filing their management circular. We haven't seen movement on this issue. So for the last couple of years, as Tamara said, we've been concerned about Dollarama's warehouse and distribution centers in Montreal. Dollarama outsources the vast majority of these staffing centers, these staffing needs of these warehouse and distribution centers to 6 third-party temporary staffing agencies. So Dollarama is not the employer. It is not responsible for hiring or training. And inside of these facilities, we hear stories of high COVID cases, concerning occupational health and safety issues, inability to socially distance during the pandemic, and other workplace injuries, and lots of other concerning things. We also hear that workers who have attempted to organize in the past have been dismissed. And it's really easy to move workers ahead of a certification vote and things like that with these kind of temporary agency setups. So this year, we've gone back to the company, but with a slightly different ask. And the reason for that is that so Dollarama has maintained in its negotiations with us over the years that these third-party agencies are vital and are kind of core to the company's operations, and that because there's a large fluctuation throughout the year in staffing needs, that this is the most appropriate setup, is to have these temporary agencies. We hear from workers that it actually doesn't fluctuate as much as the company says, that it's a fairly steady flow of work from holiday to holiday to holiday and new season to new season. But we also submit that Loblaw's own competitors, who must certainly have similar levels of fluctuation, don't support or don't disclose using third-party staffing agencies. And some of their competitors like Loblaw and Metro at least have some of those warehouses unionized. So we note that Loblaw, Metro, Canadian Tire all have vendor and supplier codes of conduct that require suppliers to allow their employers the lawful right to free association and collective bargaining. However, that is not in Dollarama's vendor code of conduct. Dollarama launched an enhanced code of conduct in June 2021 that draws on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs. But interestingly, this enhanced code of conduct does not require suppliers to respect employees' rights to free association and collective bargaining. So, we have asked the company whether it requires suppliers, including third-party staffing agencies, to respect employees' right to free association, and if not, why? I think it's a pretty straightforward question. We think it's really in line with what we're seeing other peers do. And I do think that it really, it's what we're hearing from the workers that the workers are looking for, and it also, speaks to some of the wider issues that we're seeing. Shift and the Institute for Human Rights in Business kind of look at the staffing agencies, and they say that these workers are, at heightened risk for adverse human rights impacts, especially when they can't join a trade union. And so we think that it's really reasonable to ask Loblaw where this potential gap in its code of conduct is, and why it hasn't taken this step. So we will see if we have an opportunity to engage with the company about this before the circular is finalized. But if that proposal is on the ballot on June 8th, we ask that you support it, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. And again, for those of you who are on our listserv, we will ensure that we circulate information about this resolution. And I'll, in just a sec, put up the link so that you can join. Thanks so much, Emma. So we're going to shift now to RBI, and we're going to invite Jenn Miller, who's the Director of Mission and Money with the Atkinson Foundation, to join us. The Atkinson Foundation is a charitable foundation committed to social and economic justice, and its highest priority is strengthening movements for decent work and a fair economy. Jenn joined the foundation in the summer of 2015 and had numerous positions before then, including working for the City of Toronto and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And she's also the co-chair of the governing circle of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal People in Canada. So for many years, Atkinson has been at the forefront of investor action on decent work, leading our ongoing and very impactful engagement with Restaurant Brands International, or RBI. This year, Atkinson has filed a little bit of a different resolution, and one that really addresses the situation we're seeing right now around labor standards, rising inflation, and the stage of the pandemic, or the no longer existing pandemic that we're currently in, depending on how you look at it. So we're very, very pleased to welcome Jenn Miller with us today. And Jenn, do you want to take it away and tell us a little bit about the resolution that Atkinson has filed?
Sure, thank you, Tamara. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be joining you all today, morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. And I'm joining from the near east end of Toronto on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. So Atkinson Foundation, as Tamara described, has a mission, and it has had a mission for social and economic justice for almost 80 years. We're going to celebrate 80 years this fall. We have been, for the last nearly 10 years, squarely focused on strengthening movements for decent work and a fair economy. And we do understand that the pursuit of racial justice is core to everything that we do. We think of ourselves as not just grant makers, although that is a big part of who we are as a charitable foundation, but we are also investors, active investors, and advocates, and act as an advocate. We do our work in collaboration with community organizers, policy innovators, and other investors. really to challenge income, wealth, and democratic inequality. Atkinson really appreciates the opportunity to participate in this conversation. Normally, you would see our CEO, Colette Murphy, in this little box, but unfortunately, she had a conflict that she couldn't get out of, and asked if I could share a bit of the history that we've had in this space, and specifically with Restaurant Brands International. I think Hussan has actually left the webinar, but I wanted to just do a quick shout out and thanks to him and the work of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. We've been privileged to support and learn from MWAC and migrant workers for almost a decade. And I think that most would agree that their work is needed now more than ever before. Our engagement with SHARE goes back a bit further to the early 2000s, when we as a foundation really leaned into being active owners and began in earnest to scrutinize the companies that we hold in our portfolio, to advocate as shareholders, to influence company behavior, and then to collaborate with others to, really essentially reshape the logic of capital markets. In recent years, our partnership with SHARE has zeroed in on mobilizing investors to advocate for robust, decent work policies and practices in line with our strategic priority. And what we've really realized over that time is that shareholders, like those that are on the call today, and the foundation are really holding a critical position to keep workers at the center of the companies we invest in, and to make sure that they are not the biggest casualties of an economy that is going through a particularly difficult transition. We've been doing this work with SHARE, but also directly in recent years, I want to say probably in the last 3 years, with our fund managers themselves when they engage with our investment committee. So now, as a matter of course, twice a year, our managers present to our investment committee, not just on their financial performance, but also on their activity with companies that they hold on our behalf, on issues, in particular, ESG issues generally, but in particular, issues related to decent work, racial justice, and Indigenous rights and reconciliation. The work that we've been doing with SHARE around engaging Restaurant Brands International began in 2018, when we filed a shareholder proposal at the 2019 AGM. As many may know, RBI operates 3 very prominent brands. Tamara mentioned Tim Hortons off the top, also includes Burger King and Popeyes. And for those of us that live in downtown Toronto, they do feel like things that appear on every single corner in the city right now. That initial proposal in 2019 had a simple ask: provide basic disclosure to shareholders about workforce and assign board responsibility for human capital management. And at that time, it did receive a strong vote. 66% of independent shareholders did vote in support, but this did not compel the company to act. So we didn't give up. We refiled in 2020 and did get a stronger result. And at that time, we also took a step that was, I think, considered to a degree bold, to add a recommendation to shareholders to withhold votes from the chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee as a way to really underscore how dissatisfied shareholders were with the board's inaction despite the vote that had taken place the year before. I think it's fair to say that we didn't think it would be possible to improve, or we didn't know if it was going to be possible to improve upon the 66% support from independent shareholders. But in 2020, 83% voted in favor of the proposal, with 20% withheld their vote for the director, Jose Sil, who discovered is actually the second highest paid CEO in Canada. The strong result did bring the company to the table, and we began to see that they were making some modest improvements. However, a key sticking point continued to be the company's insistence that its hands were tied, that the parent company could not be liable for workforce practices of its independent franchise operators, who essentially run their own small businesses. We understand that there is understandable legitimacy to this position. The franchise model is built on having independent operators who contribute their own capital and take responsibility for local operations. However, we also know that it's been the case that corporate operator provides an incredible amount of detailed direction to independent operators, from everything from how to brew coffee, to train employees, even how often to clean bathrooms, and not insignificantly, how to set prices. And this is the reason why you can get consistent Tim Hortons coffee, whether you're in St. John's or in Surrey. We also know that the ground for workers and companies has shifted considerably throughout the pandemic. It was not a pretty picture for many prior to the pandemic, and the last number of years has only made that worse. Here in Canada, there have been corporate lobbyists that have argued that interventions like CERB and CRB, which are modest in many ways, that they were making it impossible for businesses to hire staff. In early 2021, things started to shift more profoundly in what came as is often referred to as the Great Resignation. As economies reopened, workers simply refused to accept that they should return to vulnerable work environments, that they should accept unlivable wages and poor working conditions. As sector service employers have tended to rely on cheap, desperate, and disposable workforce, they suddenly realized that the conditions had changed. We began to see across North America stories published about retail and food service operators unable to recruit staff, reducing hours, managers and owners stepping in and covering shifts in drive-thrus or as dishwashers. And many businesses began raising wages or offering signing and retention bonuses to attract employees. For RBI and other franchise businesses, this left local operators in a bit of a bind. Generally speaking, the local Tim's or Burger King does operate on pretty slim margins. Each operator has limited capacity to control costs, as we were talking about before. They have to purchase most everything from the parent company. That menu is set by the parent, and advertising is purchased centrally. And of course, the price of whether it's the maple donut, which is kind of my Timmy's guilty pleasure, or tea or coffee is also set centrally. As a result, if operators need to shorten hours or can't keep up with demand, then that means that people in cars wait longer in the drive-through, or the lines get longer, and that's bad for sales, which in turn is bad for shareholders. We are seeing a growing number of companies investing more in the workforce, including increasing wages and benefits, and not just temporarily, but permanently. Finding ways to adjust scheduling to accommodate workers and families, seeing workers as whole people, and offering better health and safety protections. However, RBI's strategy to align with these types of progressive practices at its franchise restaurants continues to remain unclear. So that's where the proposal that we filed in 2022 this year comes in. The proposal essentially asks how RBI will keep its drive-through flowing and make sure that franchise operators can be profitable and do so in an environment that doesn't treat its workers and the workforce as disposable. This being our third year in this engagement and thinking about the other shareholder proposals that we've been involved in, we know that encouraging these shifts in company practice takes time. So we will keep pushing for transparency and asking for evidence of how the companies in our portfolio are treating its workers and how they perform relative to their competitors. This engagement is ensuring our money, Atkinson's money, all of our resources, whether it's granted out or invested, is in line with our mission to challenge inequality by creating more decent work in a fair economy. And we see our grant-making strategy and our investing strategy as inextricably linked. We also know that change is generally incremental, especially in this sphere. But we believe it is both necessary and possible, particularly when we can leverage our power as investors and act together as part of a movement to challenge income, wealth, and democratic inequality. we've been inspired by movement builders that we get to work alongside of, that are working on the ground, that are working in grassroots communities. And we know the power of community coming together. And we know that we as investors can work collectively and leverage that power and push for change. And that is why we are pleased to put forward the proposal in 2020, and why we're asking all of those on the call today to join us in supporting the proposal, to share the information widely with your networks. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions, should there be any. And I know the SHARE team can also pitch in as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was great, and what a story it is. Incredible persistence on the part of the Atkinson Foundation. Does anyone have any questions for Jen? Okay, we're about to get into a segment of this webinar that's going to include some kind of flash presentations on a series of resolutions that we hope you support. But before that, I'm going to put somebody partially on the spot, although I have Zoom chat consent for an appearance, so I'm going to consider that valid. I mentioned earlier that Bob Dhaliwal is a trustee who last year took our brief and went and approached some of his managers to ask them about proxy voting. And so Bob has kindly agreed to come on and speak to us just for a sec as a trustee and explain how that process went over last year. So Bob, what did you do and how did it go?
So yeah, thanks Tamara, and thanks for putting me on the spot. So it was great. You know, I just want to give a quick little background. I mean, when I joined as a trustee for the Waterfront Industry Pension Plan, we didn't have even ESG policy. So that was one of the first things that any trustees, you know, on the call or, you know, in pension have to establish, right? Before they can really push these kind of issues, you have to have an ESG policy. Then you kind of have a consent to move forward and start asking your managers a question. Without that, you really don't have any, you know, leg to stand on. So we made sure that was established first. We got consultation with the rest of the trustees. We're kind of growing as a plan. We're over $2 billion now, but we still run it old school. We have 6 trustees, 3 from union, 3 from the employer. I'm the administrative trustee for the union side, so I deal with the day-to-day issues, members' complaints, appeals, all kinds of stuff, right? So I'm basically the one who looks at it on a regular basis. Everybody else just shows up for the quarterly meetings, right? So when Share asked me to try pushing some of these issues with our managers, you know, we have some really big managers that are invest for us, including BlackRock, which is one of the biggest firms in the world, kind of an evil empire, if I may say. So basically, you know, the process is not hard. You take those questions that Share provides and you send them to your relationship managers. And most of the funds do have ESG teams, and what they'll do is they'll get those questions answered from their ESG teams, and they'll give you a report. A lot of plans do have reporting on ESG, so they'll send you those, you know, their policies and procedures or ESG, their annual reports, and then you can use that, you know, basically against them. And you can say, hey, this is what it says in your policy. This is what your report says, you know, based, and then you can question them on their voting record on a lot of these proxies. Which way did you vote? Did you vote for it or against it? And from that, you can start a conversation. And I feel the more trustees and plans are asking them, you know, these questions, the more pressure they have to vote in a way that's consistent with their policies. And I mean, it does take a little extra time, and I'm a busy guy, but I feel it's important, especially for a union plan, that we start pushing these issues, because we're not really doing our job. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Bob. I think you've started a new trend of surprise appearances now. That was fabulous. And hopefully for those of you on the call who are trustees sitting on funds, this gives you a little bit of inspiration and direction. So thanks very much, Bob. As always, appreciative of your work and your willingness to speak. So we're going to go back to a series of short presentations on additional resolutions. This year, there were 529 shareholder resolutions filed in the US alone. That's up from by 22% from the same point last year in 2021. So Jacob mentioned earlier that shareholder resolutions have really become something to watch and a real barometer in seeing how companies are shifting. And this year is, there's just so many fascinating resolutions. It's an incredible year. So one item that we, could spend an entire webinar talking about, and in fact, we will next week on Wednesday, is Amazon. And before I turn the mic over to James, I wanted to just mention that this year, for the first time, investors will have an opportunity to vote on a resolution that asks Amazon to report on how it upholds freedom of association and collective bargaining. So somewhat similar to what Emma is doing at Dollarama. And this resolution was filed by Share on behalf of the Catherine Donnelly Foundation. And interestingly, rather than opposing the resolution, Amazon released a counter report on fundamental labor rights in its proxy statement and on its website. And so it's telling investors, look, you don't need to vote for this resolution because we already made a report, and here it is. The problem with their report is that it restates their commitment to fundamental labor rights. And then it goes over all the company-created mechanisms in place to allow workers to express their opinions, and then reviews some of the work councils in Europe that are actually a jurisdictional requirement, and claims to be, listening to workers through these. And so this resolution is important because what we need to tell Amazon is that restating a commitment when you're spending tens of millions of dollars on anti-union consultants to crush union drives at warehouses where workers are suffering through some of the highest injury rates in the country, and that applies to Canada as well, is not enough. So we're not going to profile this resolution today, but I'll put a link in the Zoom chat for the webinar that we're hosting, that the Committee on Workers' Capital is hosting next week with the Strategic Organizing Center on key votes at Amazon. In the meantime, though, there's another equally groundbreaking resolution that we do want to draw your attention to at Amazon, and that's one calling for the company to provide investors with tax transparency. So now I have the honor of turning this over to James Infantino, who's a pensions and disability officer at the Public Service Alliance of Canada. And he's actually been there in that position for 29 years, so a real veteran of the union movement. And James represents the PSAC on the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network. So thank you, James, for agreeing to say a few words about this resolution.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Tamara. Like the focus of this webinar so far has been on shareholder resolutions that involve labor rights or decent work. I'm going to speak to a particular shareholder resolution on tax transparency that's scheduled to be presented at the annual general meeting of Amazon this coming May 25th. Now, Tamara's already talked about the webinar next week that'll deal with specifically with shareholder resolutions at Amazon. The one that I'm speaking about is tax transparency. And I think, and the reason I wanted to address this is because I believe there's a connection or a link between corporate taxation and the protection of labor rights, their communities, and inequality in society in general. Now, the resolution that I'm speaking to on tax transparency, what's significant about this particular resolution is that, in fact, it's being presented at the Amazon AGM at all. For months, Amazon has been petitioning the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to exclude this resolution from a vote at the Amazon AGM, arguing that taxation is an ordinary business matter and therefore should be subject to a shareholder resolution exemption. But thankfully, due to pressure, lobbying by institutional investors that supported the resolution, the SEC decided just a short while ago on April 5th to support the request for a shareholder resolution to be presented at the vote at the Amazon AGM. Now, evidently, this is a somewhat historical breakthrough. It's perhaps the first time the SEC has granted a shareholder request on taxation matters. The resolution I'm speaking to itself is sponsored by the Greater Manchester Pension Fund and the Missionary Oblates Investment Fund out of the United Kingdom, and has the support of 24 institutional investors, including the New York City pension funds and the university's superannuation scheme in the UK, two very large pension funds. The resolution calls for Amazon to produce a tax transparency report in accordance with the Global Reporting Initiative tax standard, the GRI tax standard. The GRI tax standard is the first comprehensive global standard for tax reporting and was developed through widespread consultation with NGOs, investors, and corporations. At the present time, Amazon does not publicly release any information on revenues, profits, or tax payments outside the US. In fact, Amazon has long been recognized as having one of the poorest records for tax conduct among the world's largest tech companies. And some of you may have remembered in 2020, Joe Biden singled out Amazon for not having paid any federal corporate tax in the US. So the resolution itself reads, shareholders request that the board of directors issue a tax transparency report to shareholders at reasonable expense and excluding confidential information prepared in consideration of the indicators and guidelines set forth in the Global Reporting Initiative's tax standard. So if you are involved in any pension funds or investment funds that hold equity positions in Amazon, we're encouraging you all to support this resolution come the annual general meeting on May 25th. Okay?
That's great. Thank you so much, James, and thank you for making the links between taxation, social protections, and some of the labor issues that we're addressing here today. Really new terrain, but important terrain.
Yes.
So does anyone have any questions for James before we move on? Okay, I'll stop asking everyone questions and then go to the next. Thanks so much. So we talked before about how many resolutions there were on ballots at company AGMs this year. And investors will see a significant number of resolutions that specifically address racial equity. And so we have with us to talk about two of these resolutions, Juana Lee. Juana is the Shareholder Engagement and Policy Analyst at Share, and she provides research and analysis on ESG issues with a focus on human rights and decent work. And she's really been leading much of the racial justice work, shareholder work here at Share. So Juana, can we bring you on? And I know that you have a couple slides as well, so maybe you can just cue Stephanie.
Thanks, Tamara. Stephanie, do you mind taking the PowerPoint? Perfect. Great. So I'm going to be speaking on the proposal on racial equity and starting wages at Walmart and the DEI reporting proposal at SNC-Lavalin. So just starting with Walmart, the proposal at Walmart requests the board of directors to oversee the preparation of a public report on whether and how Walmart's racial justice goals and commitments align with the starting pay for all classifications of Walmart associates. This proposal was co-filed by the IBVM Foundation, and it was supported by Share. So on the screen, you can see some questions that I think would be helpful for the audience to answer, but kind of just speaking more about the proposal and the history of it. So it was previously filed in 2021. It had 32% support of the independent vote. We filed the proposal again this year because the company has not sufficiently addressed investor concerns regarding the alignment between their pay philosophy and commitments to address racial inequities. So I think this proposal is particularly important this year as the US and Canada are facing record-setting financial inequities, especially for people of color, and there continues to be mounting demands for real progress on racial justice. I think at the same time, the Great Resignation is showing record-breaking turnover rates in the restaurant and retail industries, like other panelists have mentioned. Not only that, but Walmart is the largest private employer in the US. It has strong financial performance even during COVID, but it received negative media attention on worker pay. So shareholders recognize that I think the company really has an opportunity here to make meaningful progress towards its racial equity objectives by raising its starting wages. And we believe that an analysis of the demographics of starting wages would identify opportunities to really meet the company's stated commitments to address racial equity issues. I think given the concentration of people of color in these types of jobs and low-paying jobs that are seen as essential work, boosting starting wages would advance Walmart's stated commitment to really help replace the structures of systemic racism. And I think we believe that increasing wages is really the most direct route to racial equity at Walmart. In terms of its peers, Walmart increased US hourly wages to about $16.40, but starting wages at Walmart can be as low as $12. So while they did raise wages and expanded benefits for many hourly associates in 2020 and 2021, only about, I think, half of Walmart associates are earning at least $15 an hour. So they're earning less than that. In terms of wages, it's still lagging behind its peers, lagging behind Costco, Target, Best Buy, Amazon, IKEA, and Starbucks. So for years, shareholders have been having dialogue with the company concerning the lack of living wages. Investors want to understand the company's plans on raising wages, and also they believe that this report would help Walmart leadership understand the economic realities facing the company's hourly frontline associates. So the Walmart AGM is on June 1st. The company's proxy statement will be filed in about late April. And the proponent has already filed an exempt solicitation, so that can be circulated after the webinar. Next slide, please, Stephanie. Thank you. As for SNC-Lavalin, the proposal requests the company to report to shareholders on the outcomes of their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts by publishing comprehensive quantitative data on workforce compensation and composition practices by gender, race, and ethnicity. The proposal was filed by Loblaw Foundation and it's supported by Share. So why did we file this proposal? I think human capital management itself is crucial to a company, especially like SNC-Lavalin, where professional, technical, and engineering experience is key to the company's success. The company has over 50,000 employees spanning about 50 countries, and it has noted the material benefits of a diverse workforce. However, there are very clear issues with its current strategies and practices around DEI. So for example, in Canada, employees at its subsidiary Can Do Energy reported that the company failed to grant the same basic entitlements to a predominantly female bargaining unit as are enjoyed by a predominantly male bargaining unit, including access to comparable health and sick leave benefits or an equivalent harassment procedure. And these are all measures that could affect the company's ability to recruit, retain, and promote a more diverse workforce. The company is also strategically important to the Canadian and Quebec economy, yet the company has not disclosed sufficient metrics or meaningful data on its workforce. I think with little transparency around key workforce compensation or composition metrics, investors can't really assess the company's performance relative to its peers or evaluate any progress. I think ultimately, when it comes to its peers, SNC-Lavalin is not meeting leading DEI disclosure practices that have been adopted by a growing number of companies in both the US and Canada. For example, just to illustrate, between September 2020 and September 2021 alone, the number of S&P 100 companies releasing recruitment data by gender, race, and ethnicity increased by 234%. Companies releasing retention rate data increased by 79%, and companies releasing promotion rate data increased by 379%. This ultimately just shows that SNC-Lavalin is lagging significantly behind corporate America and Canada, as more and more companies are disclosing such data to meet investor expectations. In terms of engagement, Share met with the company regarding the proposal many times, but the company is unwilling to really address the substance of the proposal. I think the only way that shareholders can really be confident that the company's actions are contributing to its so-called long-standing commitment to DEI is through meaningful and comprehensive quantitative data on workforce compensation and composition practices. So the company's AGM is on May 5th. We have prepared a proxy alert. It's going to be live on our website soon, and we can circulate it after the webinar. So that's pretty much it. But if you have any questions, feel free to let me and my colleagues know. And also you can ask them through email.
Thanks so much, Juana. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, Doug, yes, please.
Sorry, did you say, Juana, where that originated from? Why did Share take this on? You had your sheet, right, of the good reasons why, but there's a lot of good reasons why for a lot of companies. And so did somebody ask or where did this come from?
I can turn this over to Anthony. He's leading this engagement. I think he has a better understanding.
Yes, thanks, Doug. So a good question, because of course, we could work on just about any issue that we've covered here today. In many cases would apply to many other Canadian and international firms. So in the case of SNC, I mean, we do have quite a bit of engagement history there. Some of which has been more fruitful than others, but it's a company we pay kind of close attention to for that reason. And we definitely did hear from some workers in the Canadian operation and their representatives about some of the issues that have been ongoing there. So we had some information that pointed us in the right direction. The website up as well that deals with some of those pieces. So for all of our engagement work, we rely on what are the most salient material issues companies facing, but also where there's good facts and where information is available. So whether it's from Migrant Workers Alliance or in this case from a group of workers at SNC, having that kind of information is certainly very helpful.
Does that answer your question, Doug?
Partially, but I'll chase it later after. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. In the past, at some of these webinars, we've promoted resolutions that were filed exclusively by unions. This year, recognizing that many of the unions we work with are working with other so-called civil society actors as well, we broadened it to focus more on topic areas that we thought would be of interest to workers, more broadly speaking. So we have one last resolution. It's actually, it's a vote recommendation calling for board accountability at Wendy's that came to our table late in the planning, but an exempt solicitation calling for the vote against is out. And to discuss this, I'd like to bring back my colleague, Jacob.
Thanks, Tamara. I'll try and go through this quickly. Last year, Wendy's shareholders filed a comprehensive and specific request for disclosure relating to the protection of workers in the company's food supply chain. Specifically, the shareholders asked for a report addressing Wendy's supplier code of conduct and the extent to which Wendy's quality assurance audits and third-party reviews protect workers in the food supply chain from human rights violations. After initially opposing the resolution, Wendy's board issued a recommendation to shareholders to vote for the proposal, and they did, got 95% of the shareholders voting in favor of the report and the protection that it would bring. But over the course of the year, the company failed to engage with the proponents, even though they had multiple chances regarding the implementation of the proposal and its oversight of human rights risks in the chain. It released a report in December, but failed to address the core disclosures that the proposal's resolved clause asked for. Wendy's failure to adequately implement a major vote shareholder proposal is contrary to major investor proxy voting standards and corporate governance best practices. And unlike its peers, it has also failed to join the Fair Food Program, which is considered the gold standard in protecting farm workers' rights in the United States. As a result, independent oversight and board renewal are urgently required at Wendy's. The board chairman and the multi-billion-dollar asset manager firm he founded have disproportionate influence, while key directors have overlong tenures and outside business relationships that compromise the board's independence. So Majority Action and investor advocates for social justice filed an accept solicitation calling on shareholders to vote against 4 directors, namely Nelson Peltz, Peter May, Matthew Peltz, and Peter Rothschild. we hope you will support this vote against.
Thanks, Jacob. And I think I'm going to hand it right back to you to walk us through to wrap this up and walk through again some steps that trustees and those on the meeting this morning who do vote proxies can take.
Sure, thank you. So we've already established that proxy voting is a valuable asset of the fund and critical part of capital stewardship, but in practice, overseeing and evaluating proxy voting can be challenging for trustee boards. So here's sort of some tips. The first step is to learn how your fund's proxy ballots are being voted. Who does the voting? Does your voting agent, whether that is your manager or proxy voting service provider, use any proxy voting guidelines? If so, do the guidelines address environmental and social issues? If you're in a segregated fund, will your manager vote your proxies according to your own guidelines? In other words, will they adopt your own proxy voting, instruction? When you're looking to hire an investment manager, include the firm's proxy voting record in the selection criteria. Make sure that trustees retain the discretion to direct its own proxy voting if they choose to do so. This should be part of your SIP, or your Statement of Investment Policy and Procedures. Some other things you can do is to sign up to the Ccsn Listserv to receive alerts about upcoming votes of interest. And you can use these alerts to talk to your managers on how they plan to vote. You can also monitor your plan's proxy ballots being voted. Proxy voting reports should be provided to the trustees on a regular basis. Quarterly is the most common. I also should say, SHARE also offers a proxy audit service as well. So get in touch with us if you'd like more information on that service. And it's okay to ask your managers to provide data points. For example, the number of shareholder proposals that they voted for, the number of the percentage of executive compensation packages they voted against. So just to recap, sort of the three main takeaways of what trustees can do this proxy season: sign up for the Ccsn Listserv. Tomorrow we'll post that again in the links. And you can use our investor brief, the proxy investor brief that's coming out next week, to send to relevant staff or managers or voting service providers, asking them to consider voting in line with the recommendations that you've heard here today. And finally, it's really important to follow up and ask them how they voted after the season's concluded, so that you can continue to track the progress of how your fund is voting. So with that, I hand it back to Tamara.
I think that wraps it up for us for the day. So thank you again, all of you, for joining for the last hour and a half for this annual event. A big thank you to our speakers who took time out of their days to share their work and their shareholder resolutions with you all. Jacob and I are available for any questions, any follow-up. And as we've mentioned several times now, we'll have a brief in your hands on Monday that we would welcome you to send to your staff or your managers. And if you haven't signed up already for our listserv, you can do so here. I've just shared the link. It's like twice in a row for good measure. Please do join our listserv. It's a fairly low traffic listserv, and it's the best way to keep up to date on what we're doing in the area of workers' capital and responsible investment. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.